In 1988, police opened a trash can inside a dark, quiet house. Inside were pictures of a girl who had vanished 4 years earlier. The first Polaroid was faded, its colors bleeding into a sickly yellow, but the face was unmistakable. It was Lily. Her eyes, wide and dark, stared into the camera with a look that wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was a hollowed-out stillness, the kind you see in old photographs from forgotten wars. The officer who found it felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He'd seen dead bodies that looked more alive than the girl in the picture. He carefully lifted it out, his gloved fingers trembling just slightly. Underneath it was another, and another, a stack of them, maybe 20 in all, preserved by the dry, stale air of the abandoned house. 4 years. 4 years of silence, of dead ends, of a family slowly breaking apart under the weight of not knowing. And now this stack of impossible moments, captured on cheap film, sitting at the bottom of a rusty metal bin. The story of what happened to Lily wasn't written in a ransom note or a confession. It was told in these silent, chemical-smelling squares. The call went out to Detective Miller, a man who had long since moved on to other cases, but had never quite let this one go. It was the one that kept him up at night, the ghost in his filing cabinet. When he arrived at the house, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. The place had been empty for a decade or so, everyone thought. The windows were boarded up, the yard a tangle of weeds, but someone had been using it, a ghost of their own. Miller walked through the sparse rooms, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. In the back bedroom, where the trash can was found, he saw the stack of photos laid out on a dusty sheet. He recognized her instantly. Lily Carver, 5 years old when she disappeared from her bed on a warm August night in 1984. Her case had been huge. A massive search, national news, a whole town holding its breath. And then, nothing. The trail went cold so fast it felt like it was never there to begin with. He picked up one of the photos. In this one, she was a little older, maybe 6 or 7. She was holding a doll, a cheap plastic one with matted yellow hair. It wasn't a doll her parents had ever seen. Behind her was a plain wall, cinder block painted a dull gray. No windows, no furniture, just Lily, the doll, and the wall. It was a prison, and someone had been documenting her time there. Who lived in the shadows of this forgotten house, taking pictures of a stolen child? The hope that ignited in Miller was a terrible, painful thing. It was the kind of hope that could destroy a person all over again. He knew he had to call her mother, Sarah. How do you make that call? How do you tell a mother that after 4 years, you have found proof her daughter was alive, but you found it in a place like this? He stood there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He thought back to the beginning, to 1984, to the morning it all started, to the look on Sarah Carver's face when she realized her daughter was gone. It was a look he had never been able to forget. Back in 1984, the morning had been ordinary. Sarah Carver made coffee, the smell filling their small, tidy house. She went to wake Lily for breakfast, the way she did every day. Lily loved pancakes on Saturdays. Sarah opened her daughter's bedroom door, a smile on her face. But the bed was empty. The sheets were pulled back, but Lily wasn't there. For a moment, Sarah wasn't worried. Lily was a playful girl. She was probably hiding. Sarah called her name. Lily? She checked the closet. She looked under the bed. The smile on her face slowly faded, replaced by a tight, cold feeling. She called her husband Mark, who was reading the paper in the living room. He came in, his face still relaxed. He said, "She's probably just playing a game." But then he saw the window. It was open. The screen was pushed out, hanging by a single corner. That's when the panic hit. A real, primal panic, that stole the air from their lungs. They ran through the house, screaming her name. They ran outside, into the yard, their voices cracking. The neighbors started coming out of their houses, drawn by the sounds of raw terror. Someone called the police. Within an hour, their quiet suburban street was filled with flashing lights and uniforms. Detective Miller arrived and saw the scene: the distraught parents, the open window, the small empty bed. He had seen it before, too many times. These cases almost always went one of two ways: a runaway, which was impossible for a 5-year-old, or a family abduction, which they quickly ruled out. That left the third option, the worst one: a stranger. The search began immediately. Hundreds of volunteers joined the police, combing through the nearby woods, checking every ditch, every abandoned shed. They knocked on every door for miles. Lily's face was on every telephone pole, in every gas station window. A smiling, happy girl with bright blue eyes and a missing front tooth. The whole country seemed to be looking for her. But she had vanished without a trace. There was no ransom note, no witnesses who saw anything strange, no forced entry, other than the flimsy screen on the window. It was as if she had just evaporated into the night air. For Sarah, those first few days were a blur of numb horror. She sat at her kitchen table, a police officer gently trying to ask her questions, while she stared at Lily's half-finished drawing of a rainbow still taped to the refrigerator. Mark was a whirlwind of frantic energy, organizing search parties, talking to reporters, trying to do something, anything. He needed action. Sarah just needed her daughter back. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She would just sit in Lily's room, holding one of her stuffed animals, rocking back and forth. The smell of her daughter was still on the pillowcase, a scent of bubblegum shampoo and childhood. Every time the phone rang, her heart would leap into her throat, a jolt of hope and fear so intense it made her sick. But it was never the call she was waiting for. It was always a reporter, a well-meaning friend, or worse, a cruel crank call from some monster getting a thrill from their pain. After a week, the search parties got smaller. The news crews packed up and moved on to the next tragedy. The hope that had burned so brightly in the community began to dim, leaving the Carvers alone in a darkness that felt absolute. The police had nothing. Miller would come by every few days, his face grim, and tell them they were still working on it. But Sarah could see it in his eyes. The trail was gone. The first year after Lily disappeared was a slow, grinding torture. The world kept moving. But for Sarah and Mark, time had stopped on that August morning. Their house, once filled with laughter, became a silent tomb. Every corner held a memory that was now a source of agony. The small scuff marks on the baseboard, where Lily would crash her toy truck. The faint crayon drawing of a sun on the hallway wall that Sarah had meant to clean off. Now she would run her fingers over it, a sacred relic. The strain on their marriage was immense. They grieved in opposite ways. Sarah clung to the past, refusing to change anything in Lily's room. She kept the door closed, preserving it like a museum exhibit. She needed to believe that Lily was coming back, and when she did, her room would be waiting for her, exactly as she left it. Mark, on the other hand, couldn't bear the constant reminders. He needed to move forward, to find a way to live with the gaping hole in their lives. He suggested they move. He said, "We can't live like this, Sarah. We're ghosts in our own home." But to Sarah, moving felt like a betrayal. It felt like giving up. It felt like burying Lily before they even knew if she was gone. The argument became a wall between them. He saw her refusal to pack up Lily's room as a refusal to face reality. She saw his desire to move as an attempt to erase their daughter. They stopped talking about it. They stopped talking about much of anything. They were two people trapped in the same nightmare, but they were experiencing it completely alone. Sarah's life shrank until it was nothing but a routine of waiting. She quit her part-time job at the library. She stopped seeing friends because their pity and their attempts to cheer her up felt like insults. How could she smile? How could she pretend everything was okay? Her only activity was her own private search. Every day, she would get in her car and drive. She drove through unfamiliar neighborhoods, her eyes scanning every park, every playground, every group of children. She would stare at the faces of little girls, looking for a flash of blonde hair, a pair of bright blue eyes. Sometimes her heart would leap. She would see a girl from behind who looked just like Lily, and for a split second, the world would right itself. Then the girl would turn around, and the crushing disappointment would wash over her again. It was a self-inflicted torment, but she couldn't stop. It was the only thing that made her feel like she was still a mother, still fighting for her child. Mark watched her fade away. He tried to reach her, but it was like she was on the other side of a thick glass wall. He started staying late at work. He started drinking more. The silence in the house was louder than any argument. One evening, he came home and found Sarah asleep in the chair in Lily's room, clutching a small, worn teddy bear. He stood in the doorway, and a wave of despair so profound washed over him that he felt like he was drowning. He knew in that moment that they were lost. Not just Lily, all of them. The case, meanwhile, had turned to ice. Detective Miller had chased down every lead, no matter how thin. He investigated every known offender in a 100-mile radius. He followed up on thousands of tips, most of them useless. There was nothing. No DNA, no fingerprints, no fiber evidence. The kidnapper had been a phantom. The case file grew thicker with reports and dead ends, but they were no closer to an answer than they were on day one. It was the most frustrating case of his career. It defied all logic. A child doesn't just disappear from a locked house in a safe neighborhood without leaving a single trace, but Lily had. 4 years. It's a long time. Long enough for a wound to scar over, even if it never truly heals. By 1988, the world had mostly forgotten about Lily Carver. Her face was no longer on posters. Her story was no longer on the news. It was just another cold case in a filing cabinet, a sad story that people in her hometown would sometimes tell. Mark and Sarah had divorced 2 years earlier. He had moved to another state, started a new life. He called Sarah on Lily's birthday and on the anniversary of her disappearance. The calls were short, filled with awkward silences. They were bound together by a tragedy they could no longer share. Sarah had stayed in the house. She couldn't bring herself to leave. It was her penance, her vigil. She got a quiet job doing data entry in a small office downtown. She didn't talk to her coworkers about her past. She was just the quiet woman in the corner cubicle. Her life was a flat line of gray, muted days. The hope she once clung to had curdled into a dull, constant ache. She no longer expected to find Lily in a playground. The driving had stopped. Now, the search was purely internal. At night, she would lie in bed and go over every detail of the day Lily disappeared, looking for the one tiny thing she might have missed. A strange car on the street. A knock on the door she didn't answer. Had she locked the back door? She was sure she had, but the doubt gnawed at her. It was a way of punishing herself. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, Detective Miller was at his desk, staring at a mountain of paperwork for a recent string of burglaries, when the phone rang. It was dispatch. An officer on a routine call wanted to run something by him. It was about a squatter call at an abandoned property on the outskirts of town, a place on Old Route 7. The patrolman sounded young, a little hesitant. He said, "Sir, we found something here. I think you need to see it." Miller was annoyed. He was busy. What could a patrolman find in some derelict house that required his attention? He almost told the kid to just log it and move on. But something in the officer's voice, a tremor of shock, made him pause. He asked, "What did you find?" There was a pause on the other end. Then the officer said, "Photos, sir. Polaroids. Of a little girl." Miller's blood ran cold. "Don't touch anything," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. "I'm on my way." He grabbed his keys and was out the door in seconds, the burglary reports forgotten on his desk. The drive out to the house felt like an eternity. Old Route 7 was a forgotten stretch of road, lined with decaying farmhouses and overgrown fields. The address was a 2-story clapboard house that had probably been white once. Now it was a peeling skeletal gray. The windows were boarded up, and a rusty "No Trespassing" sign was nailed to the front door. It looked like it had been dead for years, but as Miller got closer, he saw the signs. A faint path trampled through the weeds to the back door, a single fresh cigarette butt on the ground. Someone had been here. He found the young officer waiting for him in the back, his face pale. He led Miller inside. The air was heavy and still. Sunlight struggled through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, illuminating swirling dust motes. And there, in a back room, laid out on a dirty floor, were the pictures. Miller knelt down, his heart pounding in his chest. It was her, Lily Carver, older, thinner, her eyes holding that same empty look in every single shot. His mind raced. She was alive. For how long? Where was she now? Who was the man who took these? He looked around the room. It was almost bare. A filthy mattress in the corner, a few empty cans of beans, and the trash can. He looked inside. It was mostly empty except for some old rags and a few more photos that had been missed. At the very bottom, he saw something else. A book. A cheap, dog-eared paperback novel. He picked it up carefully. Tucked inside the front cover was a library card. It was expired, issued by a library 2 towns over. But it had a name on it. Arthur Penn. Was this him? Was this the ghost they had been hunting for 4 years? For the first time in a long time, Miller felt a surge of adrenaline, of purpose. This was it. This was the break. He knew the next step was the one he dreaded most. He had to go see Sarah Carver. He had to take this fragile, terrible spark of hope and place it in her hands. He didn't know if it would save her or shatter her into a million pieces. The drive to Sarah's house was the longest of Miller's life. What do you say? How do you prepare someone for this? He parked in front of the familiar little house, the one he hadn't visited in over 2 years. The paint was peeling in a few spots, and the garden in the front was overgrown with weeds, but otherwise it was the same, a shrine to a memory. He knocked on the door. After a long moment, it opened. Sarah stood there, looking at him with weary, questioning eyes. She was thinner than he remembered, her face etched with lines of grief that hadn't been there before. He saw a flicker of something in her expression, not hope, but a kind of automatic dread that a police officer at her door could only mean one thing. He asked if he could come in. She nodded silently and stepped aside. They sat in the living room, the same living room where he had first interviewed her 4 years ago. The air was thick with unspoken words. He didn't waste time. He said, "Sarah, we found something. We're reopening Lily's case." Her hands, which had been resting in her lap, clenched into fists. Her knuckles were white. "What?" she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. "What did you find?" He had decided in the car not to show her the photos. Not yet. They were too raw, too disturbing. She didn't need to see those images. Not until they knew more. He told her about the abandoned house. He told her about the signs that someone had been living there. And then he told her about the Polaroids. He watched as the color drained from her face. She just stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and a fragile, terrifying hope. She was alive, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a desperate plea for confirmation. He saw her alive in those pictures. He nodded slowly. Yes, in some of them she looked to be 6, maybe 7 years old. She was alive after she was taken. Sarah let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. She covered her mouth with her hand, her whole body shaking. For 4 years, she had lived in a gray limbo, not knowing if her daughter was dead or alive. She had imagined every possible horror. But the one thing she hadn't allowed herself to imagine was this, that Lily was alive, somewhere close, growing up in a dark room with a monster. The thought was both a miracle and a new kind of hell. Miller told her about the name on the library card, Arthur Penn. He said, "We're looking for him now. This is our first real lead, Sarah. Our first real name." She just nodded, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in years, the suffocating blanket of despair had been pierced by a single, sharp ray of light. It was blinding. It was agonizing. But it was there. After he left, Sarah walked in a daze to Lily's room. She opened the door, something she hadn't done in months. The room was just as it had been, the bed perfectly made, the stuffed animals arranged on the pillow. The air was stale, frozen in time. She stood in the middle of the room and wept. Not the quiet, weary tears she had cried for years, but racking, guttural sobs of pain and terror, and a hope so fierce it felt like it would tear her apart. Lily was alive. Her baby was out there. And now, they were going to find her. The thought was a prayer. "Please," she whispered into the silent room, "let me find her. Let her come home." The investigation, once frozen solid, was now moving at lightning speed. The name Arthur Penn became the single focus of the entire police department. They ran the name through every database they had. They found a handful of men with that name in the state, but none of them matched the vague profile of a loner who would squat in an abandoned house. The library card was their best clue. Miller went to the library in the next town over himself. It was a small, dusty place. The head librarian, a woman named Mrs. Gable, had been there for 30 years. She looked at the expired card and frowned. "Arthur Penn," she said. "I don't remember the name, but the handwriting on the application form is familiar." She dug through old, archived boxes in a back room for over an hour before she found it. The application was from 1981. The address listed was a post office box that had been closed for years. There was no phone number, but there was a signature. Miller compared it to other records, but it led nowhere. It felt like another dead end. The man was a ghost. Meanwhile, the forensics team was tearing the abandoned house apart, inch by inch. They were looking for anything, a hair, a fingerprint, a fiber, that could give them a lead. The place was old and had been visited by vagrants over the years, so it was contaminated. But they were meticulous. In the back of the closet in the room where Lily was photographed, a technician found something. Prime marks on the baseboard. He pulled at the board, and it came away from the wall. Behind it was a dark, hollow space, and inside that space, something was hidden. It was a small canvas bag. Inside the bag were a few items. A half-eaten bag of candy, the brand long discontinued. A child's drawing, done in crayon on a piece of brown paper bag. It was a drawing of a stick-figure girl next to a tall stick-figure man. Over their heads was a crudely drawn sun, and at the bottom of the bag, one more Polaroid. This one was different from the others. It wasn't of Lily. It was a photo of a house, a small blue house with white trim, a neat little garden in the front. There was no address visible, But on the mailbox, you could just make out a name. It wasn't Penn, it was Jensen. Miller stared at the photo. Why would the kidnapper hide a picture of this random house? Was it a past victim? A future one? Or was it something else? He ran the name Jensen through the property records for the county. He got a hit. A woman named Eleanor Jensen. She lived in a small blue house just 3 towns over. The picture was a perfect match. Miller and his partner drove to the address immediately, their sirens silent. They didn't know what they were walking into. As they pulled up, they saw an elderly woman watering her flowers in the front yard. This was Eleanor Jensen. She was in her late 70s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She looked at the police car with mild curiosity, not fear. Miller approached her carefully. He showed her a photo of Arthur Penn's signature from the library card application. He asked, "Ma'am, do you know anyone by this name?" She shook her head. "No, I don't think so." Then he showed her the sketch they had started to put together, based on a few fragments of information. A thin man, glasses, quiet. Her expression changed. A flicker of recognition. She said, "Oh, that looks a little like the man who used to help my husband with the yard work. Years ago, before my husband passed." Miller's heart hammered in his chest. He asked her, what was his name? She thought for a moment, her brow furrowed. It was something quiet, simple. She looked at Miller, her eyes clearing. "It was Arthur," she said. "His last name was Gray. Arthur Gray. He was such a nice, quiet man, always so helpful. He even helped us fix the screen on our granddaughter's window once." A chill went down Miller's spine. A new name, a new lead. This was real. They had him. Arthur Gray. The name echoed in Miller's head. It felt right. It felt real. They ran the name through the system, and this time, they got a hit. A driver's license. A social security number. A last known address. He wasn't a ghost after all. He was just a man who knew how to live in the cracks. The address was for a small apartment complex on the industrial side of a town 50 miles away. A place where people went to be anonymous. Within the hour, a tactical team was assembled. They didn't want to risk him running. Not now. Not when they were so close. Sarah was at home pacing her kitchen when the phone rang. It was Miller. His voice was different. Tense, but energized. He said, "Sarah, we have a name, a real name, and we have an address. We're going to get him." Sarah sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. The words she had waited 4 years to hear. The world tilted on its axis. She couldn't form a response. She just clutched the phone, listening to the sound of Miller's breathing on the other end. He told her to stay by the phone. He would call her the second they had him, the second they knew anything. The raid was quiet and fast. The team swarmed the dingy apartment building, moving with silent efficiency. They breached the door to apartment 2B. Inside, the apartment was sparse and grimly neat. A single bed, a small table, a chair. And sitting at the table, as if he were expecting them, was a thin, gray-haired man in his late 50s. Arthur Gray. He didn't resist. He didn't say a word. He just looked up at the officers flooding into his room with a look of tired resignation. He put his hands on the table, and they cuffed him. The apartment was searched. But there was no sign of Lily, no photos, no clothes, no toys. It was as if she had never been there. The hope that had surged through the investigation now hung in the balance. A fragile, terrifying question mark. Where was she? In the interrogation room, Arthur Gray sat in silence. He wasn't defiant. He was just empty. Miller sat across from him, studying the man who had haunted his thoughts for 4 years. He was so ordinary, a nobody. The kind of man you'd pass on the street and not remember a second later. That was his power, his invisibility. Miller started questioning him, his voice low and steady. He said, "We know what you did, Arthur. We found the pictures. We found the house. We know about Lily." For the first time, Arthur's expression flickered. A deep, profound sadness washed over his face. He looked at Miller, his eyes welling up with tears. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he whispered, his voice cracking. I was lonely." Miller leaned forward, his voice hard. "Where is she, Arthur? Where is Lily?" Arthur looked down at his cuffed hands on the table. He was silent for a long time. The only sound in the room was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then he looked up, and the words he spoke shattered the last bit of hope that had been so carefully rebuilt. "She's not here anymore," he said quietly. "She's gone." Miller felt the air leave the room. "Gone? What do you mean gone? Where is she?" Arthur's shoulders slumped. He looked like a man whose strings had just been cut. He started to talk, and the story that came out was a quiet, pathetic, and devastating tragedy. He said he had seen her playing in her yard. He had done some odd jobs in the neighborhood, and he would watch her. She was so bright, so full of life. He was divorced. His own daughter had grown up and moved away, and his life was empty. A deep, aching loneliness had settled into his bones. He said he didn't plan it. One night, he was just walking. He saw her window open. He said it was like a dream. He just did it. He lifted the screen, and he went inside. She was asleep. He picked her up, and she didn't even stir. He carried her out into the night, and no one saw a thing. He took her to the abandoned house. He had found it years before, a perfect place to be invisible. He kept her in a room in the basement that he had fixed up. It had no windows. He brought her food. He brought her toys. He took the pictures because he wanted to have memories. He wanted to pretend they were a real family, a father and a daughter. He told Miller she was scared at first, but then she got used to him. He said she would call him Mr. Art. He wasn't a monster in his own story. He was a caretaker, a lonely man who had found a friend. Miller listened, his stomach churning. This pathetic, self-pitying narrative was the reason for 4 years of agony. This was the man who had destroyed a family. Miller cut him off. He said, "Stop talking about your feelings, Arthur. Tell me what happened to her." Arthur flinched. His story continued, his voice barely a whisper now. He said after about a year, she got sick, a fever. She was coughing, and she couldn't keep food down. He didn't know what to do. He was too scared to take her to a doctor. They would ask questions. They would take her away from him. They would put him in jail. So he tried to take care of her himself. He gave her aspirin and soup. He read her stories. But she just got worse. Her breathing became shallow. One morning, he went down to the basement room, and she was just still. She was gone. He said he sat with her for 2 days. He couldn't accept it. He had taken her to save himself from loneliness, and now he was more alone than ever. Finally, he wrapped her in her favorite blanket, the one he had bought for her. He carried her out into the woods behind the abandoned house. He dug a grave with his own hands, and he buried her. He put a flat stone on top of the spot so he would always know where she was. He left the photos behind in the trash can. He said he couldn't bear to look at them anymore. He just wanted to forget. He moved away and tried to start over, to become a ghost again. After the confession, a silence fell over the room that was heavier than any sound. The truth was finally out. It wasn't a dramatic conspiracy. It wasn't a sophisticated plot. It was just a story of pathetic loneliness and unforgivable selfishness. A quiet man, a stolen child, and a stupid, pointless death. Miller had to make the call. He sat in his car in the station parking lot for 10 minutes before he could bring himself to dial Sarah's number. When she answered, her voice was tight with anticipation. "Did you find him?" she asked. "Yes, Sarah. We found him." There was a pause. "And Lily? Is she with him?" Miller closed his eyes. This was the moment. The end of the line. "No, Sarah," he said, his own voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "She wasn't with him." He told her what Arthur had confessed. He didn't soften it. He didn't try to protect her from it. She deserved the truth, as brutal as it was. He told her Lily had gotten sick. He told her she had passed away. He told her she was buried in the woods. He listened to the silence on the other end of the line. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a sob. It was just a dead, hollow silence. He could hear her breathing, a faint, ragged sound. Finally, she spoke, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Where?" she asked. "Where is she?" The next day, a team followed Arthur Gray's directions. They went back to the abandoned house, back to the woods behind it. Arthur, in chains, walked them through the overgrown trees until he stopped at a small clearing. He pointed to a flat, moss-covered stone on the ground. "There," he said. "She's right there." The forensics team worked carefully, respectfully. Sarah was there. She had insisted. She stood at the edge of the clearing, leaning against a tree, watching. Mark was there too. Miller had called him, and he had flown in that morning. He stood beside Sarah, his hand resting awkwardly on her shoulder. They didn't speak. They just watched as the earth was slowly, carefully moved. And then they found her, wrapped in a faded blue blanket. It was over. The not knowing, the waiting, the sliver of impossible hope. It was all extinguished in that quiet, sun-dappled clearing in the woods. The monster was caught. The story had an ending, but there was no relief. There was no peace. There was just a vast, empty silence where a little girl's laugh used to be. Sarah didn't cry. She just stood there, her face a mask of stone, as they carried her daughter's small remains out of the woods. The long nightmare was over, but she knew she would never, ever wake up. She had her answer, and the answer was the worst thing she could have ever imagined. It was worse than any of the 1,000 scenarios that had played out in her mind over the years. Because in some of those scenarios, Lily was still alive. In some of them, there was still a chance. Now, there was nothing. Just the cold, hard truth. A truth brought to light by a stack of faded photographs found in a rusty trash can. Weeks later, the media frenzy had died down again. Arthur Gray was in jail, awaiting a trial that he would not fight. The abandoned house was torn down, erased from the landscape, as if it had never been. The town tried to move on. Sarah and Mark held a small, private funeral for Lily. They buried her in a real cemetery, with a real headstone that had her name on it. Lily Carver, beloved daughter. After the funeral, Mark went back to his new life. He hugged Sarah goodbye at the airport. He said, "Maybe now you can start to heal." But Sarah knew that wasn't true. Healing was for people who had something left. She had nothing. She sold the house, the one she had clung to for so long. She couldn't stay there anymore. The memories were too sharp, the silence too complete. She packed a single suitcase and left. She didn't know where she was going. She just drove. One afternoon, she found herself pulling over to the side of a highway, unable to go any further. She opened her purse and took out her wallet. Tucked in the back was a single, worn photograph of Lily. It was from her 5th birthday party, just a few weeks before she was taken. She was smiling, a piece of cake on her nose, her blue eyes sparkling with pure, uncomplicated joy. Sarah stared at the picture, the last image of her daughter before the world had turned dark. She traced the outline of Lily's smiling face with her finger. She thought about Arthur Gray, the quiet, lonely man who had lived down the street, the man no one ever noticed. The man who had stolen her daughter not out of malice or hate, but out of a pathetic, selfish need to fill the void in his own life. That, in the end, was the most chilling part of it all. The monster wasn't a monster from a movie. He was just a man, a quiet neighbor, a ghost living among them, hidden in plain sight. The evil that had destroyed her life was boring. It was mundane. And it was unforgivable. She put the photo back in her wallet and started the car again, driving off toward a future she didn't want, a life she didn't know how to live. She had answers now, but the answers didn't bring peace. They just brought a different kind of pain, the quiet, permanent ache of knowing. The knowing was its own prison, with no chance of escape. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.